She was 22 years old, and she had $6. Not $6 saved carefully over a lifetime of small choices. $6 that was everything, the full sum, the entire accounting of what she owned in the world, after her Uncle Rupert Slade had set a canvas bundle on the step and closed the door of the lake house behind her without a word. We want to tell you about Elin Brask. We want to tell you what she did with those $6 and what she found when she got there, and why the people of Aspen Hollow, men and women who had never laid eyes on her before the March morning she walked into their valley, still speak her name the way you speak the name of someone who changed everything. But before we get to any of that, we need to tell you who she was. Because the ending of this story only makes sense if you understand the beginning. Elin was born in the spring of 1889 in a cedar-sided house on the eastern shore of Lake Winnipeg in the Manitoba that was still new enough that the roads between settlements were more suggestion than fact. Her mother, Hanne Brask, had come from Norway at 18 with a brother named Rupert and a cousin named Thora, and had married a man named Erik Brask who worked the lake as a gill netter from May to October and cut cordwood the rest of the year. They were not rich, but the house was their own, and the lake gave them fish, and Hanne kept a kitchen garden on the south side that she tended with the particular intensity of someone who had grown up understanding what a bad summer could mean. Erik Brask died when Elin was 7. A late-season storm on the lake, a boat found 2 days later upturned on a gravel bar, and a man who was not found at all. What remained after Erik was the house, the debt against it, the garden, and 2 people. Hanne, who was 31, and Elin, who was 7, and who did not fully understand for several months that her father was not coming back from the water. But this story is not really about Erik Brask, or even Hanne Brask. This story is about what Elin learned before she was 20, and from whom she learned it. Her aunt, technically her aunt by marriage, though the distinction never meant much to either of them, was a woman named Gudrun Halvorsen Brask, who had married Erik's older brother Poul before Poul was killed at 30 in a sawmill accident outside of Portage-la-Prairie. Gudrun was 43 when Erik died, and she was a cooper. Not an amateur, not a hobbyist. A proper working cooper who had learned the trade from her father in Tromsø and who had kept at it after emigrating, because barrels do not care where you learn to make them, only whether you can. She lived 7 miles north of Signy's house on a piece of land that backed up against a creek, and her cooperage was a low shed behind the cabin that smelled of steamed oak and shaved cedar and the particular sweetness of fresh wood. She had no children, and when Erik died and Hanne began to struggle in the way that women with 1 income and 1 child and a lake debt always struggle, it was Gudrun who appeared every second week with a smoked fish or a sack of oats, and who eventually and without any ceremony took Elin on as a learner. We are not going to skip over this part. The years with Gudrun matter. The people who knew Elin later would tell you that you could not understand her without understanding those years. Gudrun taught Elin to work with wood the way a musician teaches a student to hear. Not by explaining, but by doing and making the learner do, and correcting the doing until it became second nature. By the time Elin was 12, she could drive a hoop onto a stave set without splitting the wood. By 14, she could cut a crow's groove clean enough that the head would seat without leaking. By 16, she could build a tight barrel from raw stave stock in a day, and she had developed the particular kind of physical intelligence that comes from years of making things with your hands, a sense for grain direction, for the way damp wood behaves differently from dry, for the sound a well-set hoop makes versus one that is about to slip. Gudrun was not a sentimental woman. She was precise and demanding, and she did not give praise the way some teachers do, scattered like seed hoping something grows. When she said something was good, it was good. When she said nothing, you kept at it. She gave Elin one thing, not at the end of her teaching but in the middle of it, on an afternoon when Elin was 15 and had finally managed a crow's cut that ran true all the way around a 2-gallon keg without drifting. Gudrun picked up the keg and looked at the groove and set it back on the bench and opened the long drawer at the end of the workbench and took out a tool and placed it in Ellin's hand. It was a crow's. The blade was old Swedish steel, sharpened so many times it had grown narrow as a reed. The handle was birchwood, pale and smooth, and it had been shaped by someone who understood that a tool you hold for hours must fit the hand as if it had always been there. Gudrun said, "My father made that handle. He cut the birch from behind our house in Tromsø and shaped it himself. He said the wood was better than the steel." Elin held it and felt the weight of it, and understood she was being given something that could not be replaced. Hanne Brask died the winter Elin was 19. Pneumonia, quick and merciless, in the way that illness is sometimes quick and merciless in a way that seems entirely wrong, as though it had not taken into account who the person was or how much more they had left to do. Elin nursed her mother for 3 weeks, and then buried her in the churchyard, at the edge of the settlement, in ground frozen, hard as iron, in a coffin. Elin built herself from the last of the cedar planks in Gudrun's shed, because it was the thing she knew how to do, and she needed to do something she knew. Gudrun had died the previous spring, of a stroke that came on a Tuesday afternoon in April, while she was standing at the shaving horse. It took her so fast that the draw-knife was still in her hand when she fell. Elin had found her. She had washed her and dressed her and buried her beside Pool, in the small plot east of the cooperative. She had gone back into the shed and stood at the bench for a long time, with her hands flat on the wood, feeling the grain under her palms. After Hanne died, Elin returned to the lake house. She was 19 years old. The house was paid off, the lake debt retired 5 years earlier, 1 season at a time, and she intended to keep the cooperative work going. There was enough demand. The farms spread across the flat country south of the lake all needed barrels. For salt pork, for grain, for pickling, for salted fish. She was competent, she had Gudrun's tools, she had orders enough to keep her working through spring. It was Rupert Slade who ended that. Her uncle had not been a presence in Ellen's life since she was small. He had come from Norway with Hanne, and then moved steadily westward following work. First Winnipeg, then Regina, then a stint in the Kootenays. That left him with a limp and a wife named Dorothy, and a set of opinions about property that he had refined over 2 decades into something nearly theological. He arrived at the lake house in March, 3 weeks after Hanne's funeral, with Dorothy and a hired wagon, and the calm authority of a man who has already decided what is going to happen and is now simply executing the decision. He sat at the kitchen table with a cup of Ellen's tea and explained to her, pleasantly, carefully, the way you explain something to someone you have decided is not quite capable of grasping it. That as the only surviving male in Hanne Brask's family line, he had certain claims on the property that Elin, as an unmarried daughter, did not. This was not true. The house was in Hanne's name, and Hanne's will, which existed in the possession of a solicitor in Gimli, left everything to Elin. Rupert Slade knew this. But Rupert Slade also knew that solicitors in Gimli cost money to consult, and that a young woman alone in a lakeside house in March was not likely to find the process of contesting him simple, and that Dorothy was already measuring the kitchen window for new curtains. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He was, in the way of men who understand that power is most effective when it wears good manners, entirely reasonable about it. He gave Elin until the following Saturday to remove what she wished to take. He noted that the cooperative tools had belonged to Gudrun and might be contested as part of the Brask estate. He was still looking into it, and that in the meantime, she should perhaps leave them where they were. Elin removed nothing from the cooperative. She packed a canvas bag with her clothes and her grandmother's shawl, and she placed the birch-handled crows in the breast pocket of her coat, close to her body, where she could feel the weight of it. She put her savings, $6 in coins and 2 crumpled bills she had pressed flat, into a tobacco tin, and she set the tin in the bag. She said nothing to Rupert or Dorothy, and she walked out of the lake house on a Saturday morning in late March, with the snow still deep in the ditches and the sky, the color of old pewter, and the wind off the lake cold enough to make her eyes water. She did not look back, and if anyone watched her go from behind the curtained window, they did so at a safe distance, in the way that cowardice always watches courage, through a veil, without showing itself. She walked south because the road ran south. She followed it for 2 days, sleeping one night in a church that had been left unlocked, eating what she had brought, until she reached a crossroads where a hand-painted sign pointed west toward a settlement called Aspen Hollow. We should tell you that she had not chosen Aspen Hollow. She had not heard of Aspen Hollow. She turned west because the wind was at her back in that direction, and because the word hollow sounded, in the way that tired people sometimes hear words, like a place that had room in it for something new. The valley she descended into that second evening was not dramatic. It would not make a painter reach for a canvas. It was a wide, flat-bottomed cut in the prairie, with a river running through the center of it, the Pembina, running dark with snowmelt, and a scatter of farms along its banks, the buildings low and dark against the pale light of evening. There was an aspen grove on the eastern rim that gave the place its name, the trees bare in March but dense enough to break the wind. and the overall impression, as Elin came down the grade in the last of the daylight, was of a place that was working hard at the business of existing and had not yet decided whether it would succeed. At the bottom of the grade was a cluster of 4 buildings, a general store with its shutters closed, a livery with 1 horse in the paddock who looked at her with the mild indifference of horses, a meeting hall with a bell tower and no bell, and a low building of squared timber with a sign in the window that read, Aspen Hollow Land Registry, R.H. Cass, Registrar. There was a lamp burning behind the sign. Elin pushed the door open. The man at the desk was about 60, with a white mustache and round spectacles and hands stained to the second knuckle with ink. He looked up at her, the way people who have been registrars for a long time look up at strangers who arrive in the evening. With attention rather than surprise, cataloging quietly, noting the canvas bag, the coat, the mud on her boots, the steadiness of her gaze. "You look cold," he said. "I have been walking," she said. His name was Harold Cass, and he had kept the Aspen Hollow Land Registry for 19 years, and he knew every quarter section in the valley the way a shepherd knows every animal in the flock, by name and location and history and temperament. He offered her a chair and a cup of tea that had been sitting too long on the stove and was nearly the color of boot leather. And he listened while she explained, in as few words as possible, that she had $6 and wanted to know what it could buy. He removed his spectacles and cleaned them on his waistcoat and replaced them and opened his ledger. It took him a while. He turned pages slowly, running a finger down columns of figures in the careful way of a man who takes accuracy seriously. He stopped on the 3rd page and tapped an entry with his ink-stained finger and said, "There is one property, the Wicklund place, a trading post and cabin, 15 acres on the west bank of the river, with a root cellar and a hand-dug well and a small outbuilding. It has been standing empty for 9 years. The territorial government has been carrying the assessment. The back taxes come to $5.70. He looked at her over his spectacles. $6 would cover it, with 30 cents to spare. Elin opened the tobacco tin and counted the money onto the edge of his desk, bills and coins she had carried for 2 days. And Harold Cass counted it again and made a notation in his ledger and signed a receipt and handed it across. And just like that, for $6, Elin Brask became the owner of 15 acres on the Pembina River, and a building she had never entered, and whatever lay within it and beneath it, known and unknown. She reached the Wicklund place the following morning. Having slept on a cot, Harold Cass unfolded in the back room, without making any ceremony of it, simply showing her where the blanket was and where the stove damper was and telling her the road west would take her straight there. The cabin and the trading post were attached, a long, low structure of squared logs with a covered porch running the full length of the south face. The trading post occupied the larger, eastern section. The cabin was to the west, smaller, with a stone chimney that had partially collapsed at the cap. The roof was cedar shake, and the south slope had held reasonably well, but the north slope had opened in 2 places, the lath showing like ribs. She walked around it before touching anything, in the way Gudrun had taught her to walk around any structure first, taking in the whole before looking at the parts. The foundation was good, river stone laid dry and level. The logs were tamarack, dense and resistant, and they were sound. She could see that even through 9 years of gray weathering. Whatever time had done to the surfaces, the bones were honest. The door of the trading post was swollen in its frame, and she had to put her shoulder against it. It opened into a room that smelled of cold ash and dried mud and something faintly resinous, cedar, slowly releasing what it had stored over years of silence. The counter along the north wall was intact. The shelving behind it was empty but solid, pegged construction, the same careful joinery as the walls. The floor was wide spruce planks, and 3 near the east wall had cupped and lifted, leaving gaps you could put a hand through. Near the hearth on the west side, where the cabin section began, 2 planks had risen entirely from their joists, buckling upward in a low arch. She knelt there and ran her fingers along the seam the way you learn to read a joint, feeling for what is there before you look. The wood was sound, but the subfloor beneath had dried unevenly. She took the birch-handled crows from her coat pocket. Not because it was the right tool for prying up a floorboard, but because it was the tool she had, and because her hand went to it whenever there was a problem in front of her. She worked the blade into the gap at the end of the second lifted plank and eased it back and forth, feeling for the release point the way Gudrun had taught her, gently, with patience, cooperating with the wood rather than fighting it. The plank came up in a long groan. Beneath it was darkness, the crawl space, the stone pier footings, the packed clay of the valley floor. She lifted the second plank and the third, setting each aside carefully, checking each one as she went, because spruce that old could still be useful if you did not split it. When she lifted the fourth plank, the one closest to the hearth, the one the arch had been centered on, she saw it. Not clearly at first. Just a shape in the shadow beneath the joist, something that did not belong to the geometry of stone and earth and wood. She leaned down and her eyes adjusted, and she saw that someone had set a flat stone to one side in the crawl space and dug a careful rectangular cavity into the clay beneath it, roughly the size of a bread tin, and sitting in the cavity was a box. Cedar. She knew by the density and the faint sweet smell that comes out of undisturbed cedar even after decades. Someone had wrapped the lid seam in a strip of tallow-dressed canvas pressed flat into the joint. The same technique she used to seal a water joint in a barrel head before fitting it. She recognized the work. She understood immediately that whoever had put this here had done it with care, with the intention that time would not get inside. She set the box on the floor beside her and peeled the canvas away slowly, using the crow's blade to lift the edge without tearing. The lid came off clean. There were 3 things inside. The first was money. Bills folded flat and wrapped in a piece of flannel, with coins packed in a layer of dry sawdust around them to keep them from shifting. She did not count it then. She would count it later, sitting beside a fire she coaxed from coals that were somehow, impossibly, still warm in the hearth, and the total would be $112. She would sit very still for a long while after she finished counting. The second thing was a carved wooden figure, a snow goose, no longer than her thumb, rendered in pale birch that had aged to the color of cream. The wings were folded, the neck curved downward slightly, in the posture of a goose feeding. The carving was precise and unhurried, the kind of work that takes time, because it was done for the pleasure of the doing. The third thing was a letter. A single sheet of paper, folded twice, sealed with a drop of wax that it held. The paper was not yellowed, which told her the cedar and the canvas had done their work. The handwriting was regular, slanting slightly to the right, in the hand of someone who had learned to write carefully and written carefully ever since. She carried it to the open door and held it in the morning light and read it. My name is Hanne Wicklund. I came to Aspen Hollow in 1874 with my husband Peter, who had been a dock worker in Bergen, and who believed the Canadian prairie would be kinder to his lungs than the sea air had been. We built this trading post and the cabin together in our first summer here, and for 11 years it was our livelihood and our home and the place where we knew ourselves. Peter died in the winter of 1885, of the same thing he had come here to escape. His lungs, in the end, had their own idea about things. I ran the post alone for 6 years after that. I am leaving because I am old, and my sister in Winnipeg has asked me to come, and I do not think I will return. I have no children. I have no one to leave this to who was kin. But I want to tell you something about this place, because you deserve to know it. In the autumn of 1876, 2 years after we arrived, I filed this property with the Territorial Postal Authority as an official postal receiving and dispatch point for the Aspen Hollow settlement. At the time, the nearest mail service was 40 miles east, and the valley had nothing. The license is a territorial license, and it runs with the property, not with the owner. I applied once, it was approved, and it has never lapsed, because I never closed the post, and I never told anyone I was leaving. What this means, and I asked a solicitor about it before I left, because I wanted to be sure, is that whoever owns this property now holds the postal license for Aspen Hollow. The holder is entitled to receive and dispatch mail on the territorial route. For 9 years this valley has had no postmistress and no mail. I do not know how they have managed. But I know that when I was here, a letter from the government, a letter from a child who had gone to the city for work, a letter from a sister in another province, those things mattered to the people of this valley, the way water matters in a dry summer. They matter completely. Take the money. Fix the north roof first. It was leaking when I left, and 9 years will not have improved it. The well is good. The soil along the creek is the best in the valley for growing things. I have left you the goose that Peter carved during our first winter here, when the snow was so deep we could not get the door open for 3 days, and he needed something to do with his hands. He said he carved it because he was thinking about home. He meant Bergen, but I think he also meant here. This place became home faster than either of us had expected. I do not know who you are. I do not know if you are young or old, man or woman, rich or struggling. But I know this. You are here and this place needs someone, and perhaps you need it too. I hope you will be happy here. I hope this place will be as good to you as it was to me. Hanne Wicklund, September 1891. Elin read the letter twice. She folded it carefully and set it on the hearthstone beside the cedar box. She picked up the carved snow goose and held it. The birch was warm in her hand. Wood is always warmer than you expect, warmer than stone, warmer than metal, as though it remembers the sun it once grew toward and holds a little of it for you. She stood in the open doorway for a long moment, looking out at the Pembina River, catching the late morning light, and she was quiet, and she was still, and she did not cry. Then she went to work. She started with the north roof, as Hanne had said to. The logic was clear. You cannot repair the inside of a building when the outside is open to the weather. And the logic was also something else, something she could not have named precisely but could feel. The roof had been Hanne Wicklund's first concern, and making it right felt like answering a letter. She found cedar bolts in the stand of trees along the creek south of the property, trees felled by a wind at some point in the past 9 years, the wood still good if you got to it before it rotted through. She split shakes with a splitting knife she found hanging in the outbuilding. And she worked the north slope for 4 days in the cold spring air. The angle of the wrist, the judgment about overlap, the particular attention to the ridge, every motion familiar, every decision one Gudrun had taught her to make. It was on the 3rd day that the first person came. A woman on a gray horse, stopping in the road and watching for a long moment from the saddle. Not with suspicion, with the frank appraisal of someone deciding what they are looking at. Then she dismounted, tied the horse to the fence post, and walked across the yard and stood at the base of the ladder and looked up. You are on the Wicklund roof, she said. I am, Elin said. It has needed doing for 9 years. I can see that. The woman's name was Sigrid Thorvald. She was 47, the wife of a wheat farmer named Lars who ran 300 acres on the east side of the valley, and she had the particular directness of someone who had grown up in a remote place and had long since stopped seeing any use in approaching the thing sideways. She looked at Elin's work on the upper course and was quiet for a moment. Then she said, You know what you are doing. My aunt taught me, Elin said. She was a cooper, but the principles are the same. Sigrid Thorvald nodded, as though this made complete sense, which to her it did. Come for supper tonight, she said. Lars will want to know who you are. Elin came for supper, and at the table, she told them she had purchased the Wicklund property from the land registry and intended to run cooperative work from the outbuilding. And then she told them what she had found. Not all of it. Not the money, not the goose, not the parts that were between herself and Hanne Wicklund, but the postal license, that she told them in full. Lars Thorvald set down his fork. Sigrid sat very still. Their son Gunnar, 15 years old, looked between his parents as if waiting for a cue that did not come. Lars said Hanne had a postal license. She did, and it runs with the property. We have been sending our letters out with the grain wagon to the post office at Clearwater, he said. 40 miles, 4 times a year if we are lucky. Sigrid Thorvald said quietly. There are people in this valley who have not had a letter from their children in 2 years. Word travels in small settlements the way water travels in flat country, finding every low channel, reaching every corner, moving faster than you would think possible in a landscape that appears to offer it no particular speed. Within a week of the supper at the Thorvalds, every household in Aspen Hollow knew that a young woman had bought the Wicklund place and that the Wicklund place held a postal license that had been sleeping, unexercised, for 9 years. They came the way people in that country come when they have decided someone is worth coming to. Not all at once, not as a crowd, but 1 and 2 at a time, each with something in hand. A man named Claude Arsenault, 61, who ran the livery and kept a small herd of milk cows, appeared with a load of split firewood in his wagon and stacked it under the eave without being asked, and when Elin thanked him, he said, There were 3 winters. I would not have made it through if Hanne Wicklund had not had the post open. You are doing right by her. A woman named Dorothy Muller, 44, a homesteader from the north end of the valley, came with her husband Franz, carrying 2 window sashes with glass intact, wrapped in burlap, pulled from their barn during a renovation. Franz helped Elin set them in the trading post's front windows and asked nothing in return except to be told she was planning to stay. A boy of 12 named Samuel Garreau, who farmed with his widowed mother on the quarter section nearest the river, showed up one morning with a note that said, "My son is strong and has no school until May. He would like to help if you have work for him." Elin put him to work carrying split cedar and rechinking the cabin wall, and she paid him with meals and a lesson each afternoon in the cooperage. Because he asked about the tools with the attentiveness of someone who genuinely wanted to know. And because Gudrun Halvorsen Brask had taught Elin, by example if not by words, that knowledge is not diminished by being given away. She set up the cooperage in the outbuilding. She had Gudrun's crows, and she found in the outbuilding a set of other tools. Some hands, some left by others over the years, some so old she could not guess their origin, that were usable once she cleaned and sharpened them. She made her first barrel for Claude Arsenal, in exchange for 4 months of hay for a goat she hadn't yet acquired, but knew she was going to need. She made her second for Franz Müller, grain storage, and he paid her in cash, $6 even. And she held the coins for a moment before putting them in the new tin she had bought to replace the tobacco tin. Because the tobacco tin had been her emergency measure, her last resort vessel, the container for a life that was down to its final small certainty. She did not need that kind of tin anymore. The postal license took 3 months to activate. There was a form to file with the territorial office, and a form to receive back, and an inspection visit from a postal agent who came from Winnipeg in June and walked through the trading post, with his hands clasped behind his back, mouth slightly open, making calculations that seemed to surprise him. He said the facility was adequate. He said the license was in order. He said the first mail drop would be in July, on the Tuesday route. The first Tuesday in July, Sigrid Thorvald arrived at 7 in the morning and sat on the porch of the trading post and waited. By 8 o'clock there were 11 people on the porch and in the yard. By 9 there were 23. The postal wagon came at 9:30, driven by a young man who seemed genuinely surprised to find a receiving crowd waiting for him. He unloaded the mail sack with a formality the situation perhaps warranted more than he knew. There were letters for 9 families in Aspen Hollow. Some had been sitting at the Clearwater office for months, waiting for someone to collect them. One letter was 18 months old. There was a woman named Helen Gouin, 70 years old, who had a letter from her daughter in Toronto, a daughter she had not had word from in 2 years, and Elin watched her read it standing in the yard with the July sun on her face, not moving, not making a sound, for a very long time. We will not tell you what was in that letter. Some things are not ours to tell, but we want you to know what it looked like, because it is the image from that morning that stays with us. An old woman standing in a yard in a small valley in Manitoba, holding a letter she had waited 2 years to receive, and the way the light fell on her. Elin Brask stood on the porch of the trading post that morning, her trading post now, and watched the people of Aspen Hollow read their letters. She had Hanne Wicklund's snow goose in her coat pocket. She could feel the weight of it against her ribs, the carved birch holding the warmth of her body, and returning it slowly, the way wood does. She thought about Hanne Wicklund, who had run a post for 17 years in a valley that needed one, and who had sealed a cedar box in the floor to make sure that whoever came next would know what they had inherited. She thought about Gudrun Halvorsen Brask, who had placed a crows in a girl's hands and said only, "Feel that? That is the wood telling you where it wants to go." She'd thought about the 40 miles between Aspen Hollow and Clearwater, and the 4 times a year the grain wagon made the trip, and the letters that had sat in a sack somewhere while children grew older, and parents got ill, and ordinary life accumulated its weight of unshared news. She thought about Rupert Slade. She thought about the lake house, and the curtained window, and the canvas bundle on the step. She carried those things the way she carried everything. Quietly, without complaint, in a place where they could not be lost, but could no longer do harm. By the first snow of that year, the cooperage at the Wicklund place had 6 standing orders. The trading post received mail every Tuesday and held it without charge. The cabin was tight and warm. The chimney rebuilt, the windows sealed, the floor level and solid underfoot, the boards pegged with oak dowels. Elin had turned herself in the cooperage on 2 October evenings after the light was gone from the yard. On the shelf above the cabin hearth, she kept 3 things. Hanne Wicklund's letter, folded and placed against the back wall. Peter Wicklund's carved snow goose, standing on its small flat base with its neck curved toward the room, and Gudrun Halvorsen Brask's birch-handled crows, resting on its side, the old Swedish steel still sharp, the pale handle still warm to the touch in the way that wood is always warm, holding whatever heat you give it and returning it slowly. She was 22 years old. She had walked into a valley she did not know with $6 and a tool in her pocket, and she had bought a building no one wanted at a price that should not have been enough to buy anything worth keeping. And beneath its floorboards, a woman she would never meet had left her not just the means, but the proof that someone had been here before her and had loved this place and had believed, without knowing anything about who would come next, that whoever it was deserved to find something waiting. We think about Elin Brask sometimes, when we come across places that have been left and then found again. And we find ourselves wondering. We would like to ask you directly, whether there has ever been a place like that in your life. A thing that was already waiting before you knew you needed it. If there has been, we would very much like to hear about it.